Hello everyone and welcome to the Logistics Point interviews. I'm Nick Pushilov. Today I'm joined by James Smith, Managing Director and Partner at Autostore System UK and Ireland. James and I are going to talk about the future of retail and logistics and how some companies managed to accelerate their growth despite the pandemic. So I wanted to start with the question of, 2020 has been transformational, definitely. But was it a good transformation or was it a bad one?
That is a fantastic question. I think if we break 2020 down into two halves, I think there's a good and a bad actually in 2020. The bad is the huge shift that the COVID global pandemic has encouraged people to make, which is a lot of people now, either if they've been using online ordering and e-commerce previously, they've percentage-wise increased the amount of usage of e-commerce, or the number of people now that are really using e-commerce that never used to use e-commerce before
Mhm.
has exposed some real challenges within the existing supply chains that the logistics industry uses today. So typically what we've seen across, especially the UK, is still very much centralized distribution of goods that relies on huge central distribution centers, very large warehouses, to actually send in bulk goods into typically retail stores for those goods to actually be decanted, broken down into item level within the retail stores for people to go and purchase ultimately. I think what we've seen though in 2020 is this huge shift onto e-commerce means that actually those logistics networks that are organized in that way simply don't work anymore. And that's the real bad of the situation, that the retail sector's suddenly been hit with this massive shift. And many people have talked about what's happened in 5 months being what they would predict over 5 years. It really has been that much of a dramatic shift. So the bad is really exposing those limitations, those issues around the supply chain and logistics systems that are in place today. But then we look at the good. Actually, what it has done is it's enabled a lot of businesses that have already invested in actually providing good e-commerce services to actually grow. And it's enabled and accelerated a lot of growth plans around incorporating automation into the retail and the logistics sector. Plans that were potentially 5 years in advance suddenly are coming into now being within a year that people are talking about. So I think there's some really good things that have come out of it as well.
And how about logistics? Do you think that it managed to cope with all the demand? There were problems specifically in the beginning with capacity. Now we're again in a lockdown in the UK. And has capacity been resolved and has distribution become smoother?
Yeah, I think the supply chain back in March 2020 was hit with, I know the word unprecedented is probably overused, but the demands that were suddenly being placed on the grocery sector especially, but the whole retail sector were never experienced by anybody, and nobody had ever predicted that demand for even the most fundamental things as toilet paper. Nobody was predicting that, nobody expected that, and none of the supply chains. I know a lot of criticism has been levied at the grocers for not having sufficient stocks available, but they have supply chains that they rely on, and nobody within that supply chain was ready for that huge peak in demand. And also the sudden shift in change in terms of the way people wanted to shop. Even if we look at the grocery sector, moving very much from being very comfortable going into store, doing a weekly or a bi-weekly shop, to all of a sudden overnight, people wanting home delivery or click and collect services,
Yeah.
which of course meant that the retail sector were faced and consumers were faced with possibly a week until they could get a delivery slot, or even at the worst cases, 5 to 6 weeks before delivery slots were available. They were really unprecedented times. I think what's changed though is because we've had limitations on the way we live. We've had lockdowns of various different levels for almost 12 months now. The supply chain industry has adapted really, really quickly. And that retail and that grocery industry has adapted very, very quickly to ensure that if there is sudden peaks again, that they can manage it better. And I think equally us as consumers, there was mass panic
Yeah.
back in March 2020. Suddenly, people went into overdrive thinking that there'd be no bare essentials of things that you need for life on the shelves and available, which of course meant that there was this massive demand that the retailers couldn't actually match. I think this time what we're seeing within grocery and within retail is people reacting more normally. They've lived through March last year. They realized that actually that bulk buying of toilet rolls probably wasn't necessary. It probably took them 2 or 3 months to actually use all of those toilet rolls they bought. So what they're actually doing this time is behaving more naturally, which of course means that the supply chain isn't under as much pressure as it was before. So I think actually both the consumer and the supply chain have adapted quite well through the real heavy peak that we saw 12 months ago or almost 12 months ago. And now we're in the latest lockdown that, consumers are behaving more normally, and that means the supply chains to a certain degree can act more normally as well.
Do you think that part of this adapting of supply chains will be micro-fulfillment centers?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think what the supply chain industry and again looking specifically around grocery and retail here, what the supply chain industry's realized is through the pandemic, there's two things happen. One, they've been increasingly challenged of availability of their own staff to
Mhm.
work either in a central warehouse location, be that doing bulk retail supply, where they're actually doing bulk picking activities and shipping into retail stores, or even individual direct-to-consumer picking and more of an e-commerce view. They've been challenged with people. They've been challenged because they need to provide, even in these central warehouse locations, socially distanced environments for their people to work in. And quite often those warehouses are just not designed for that today. So they've got a challenge around ensuring there's enough staff to meet demands and also providing a very safe working environment for those staff to be working in as well. If you actually then look at the retail space today, equally speaking, we're actually looking at a real big challenge of people, and then go into any grocery store in the UK that's doing online offers as well, any of the really big grocery supermarkets, and you'll see people pushing trolleys, doing picking of people's orders to then be fulfilled for click and collect or delivery. Again, that's creating a huge volume of people in the actual aisles of supermarkets, and people become uncomfortable with that situation. That's affecting those retail customers. What that means is more and more companies now are saying, how can we automate these processes? How can we actually implement different processes, different technologies, automation, robotics, etc., into our retail spaces, be that in the DCs, or more and more importantly, how do we actually create a socially distanced environment in the retail space that allows more customers to come in, allows them to actually have that 2 meter
Mhm.
space that everybody's being told that we need to keep, and actually at the same time facilitates this massive surge in demand that the retailers are seeing for still the click and collect services and the home delivery services. So the retailers are really looking twofold. They're saying, how do we better utilize our people, and in doing that, how do we create a more socially distanced environment for shoppers that still want to come into the store and actually do their grocery shop? But actually, to combine with that, how do we increase the volume of click and collect and delivery orders that we can be processing through the existing retail store network? So I think really that's driving this idea about micro-fulfilment, which is micro-fulfilment is very much a buzzword, but that's all around actually bringing automation into the retail space.
And how do you think that the warehouse of the future is going to look like? Is it going to be too automated? Do we need to start building them from scratch again and just forget about everything else that we've done so far?
I think there's two ways of answering that. There's two very good points there that you just raised. The first thing is warehouse of the future. I've been lucky enough to listen to a lot of industry experts' presentations around how they see the future of not just the logistics industry, but actually the manufacturing and many of the key industries we've got in the UK. And many people will actually say that within probably 10 years' time, by 2030, a huge amount of the manual jobs that actually exist today will have been replaced by an automated process. And that automated process is probably going to be robotics of some description, be it a robot arm doing picking or a robot moving around within a warehouse facility, carrying out the actions that would normally be carried out by a person. So there's no doubt that the warehouse of the future will see much more robotics. And I think if we just look at, for instance, the automotive industry, we look at the pictures of the automotive industry back in the 1970s and 80s, there were thousands of people welding car bodies together and doing car assembly. If you look at the automotive plant of today, actually it's robots that do probably 80 to 90% of that work. And I think the warehouse industry, we can expect the warehouse of the future to follow suit, that there'll be much more reliance on automation and robotics to take away some of that manual processing that's happening today. In terms of the second question you raised there is, should we just flatten everything and rebuild it? The answer from our perspective is no. As a solution provider, we're able to totally redefine brownfield existing space. And not just redefine it, but actually repurpose it and increase the efficiency of it, increase the amount of inventory that we can store in that existing warehouse. And in turn, not just increase the amount of inventory, but actually increase the amount of throughput that we can put through that as well. So we can actually increase the amount of volume that's going into and out of the warehouse, potentially with less people. So it's a real win-win for these warehouses of the future. And it all stems back to, and it all ties back to investment in automation.
And what happens to all the people who are working in logistics or retail right now, and they can hear you and they can say, well, I have no idea about anything about robotics or robots. What is happening to my job?
It's a great question, and it's one that we hear all the time, not just associated with our solution, but associated with robotics and automation. I think the answer is there is, of course, going to be some job changes that will happen. But we're already within the logistics and the supply chain industry seeing a real challenge of just not having enough people available. We've gone are the days when we could rely on agencies providing people for those peaks like Black Friday, Christmas, and those other peak times during the year. Those available people, that free market of available labor just doesn't exist anymore. So I think that's one challenge that has definitely happened over the last probably 2 to 3 years. The second thing I would say about jobs is, although we can bring robots in, we can bring automation into a company, all of that requires people to actually maintain it. If you just look at the Autostore system, for instance, our robots require periodic maintenance, inspection, spare parts being replaced, etc. Within our system, we are as a business investing huge amounts in people and looking at adding something like 25 to 30% more people into our business this year alone, specifically focusing around things like design, computer programming, robotic programming, software engineers, engineers of the future. So these are much better jobs that we're creating, and that's being driven by the growth in actual automation within the warehouse and logistics industry. So what I would say to people is, yes, we can see job changes happening, but actually I think the jobs of the future will be higher skilled, higher paid, and much more rewarding than those manual jobs that exist in the warehouse today.
And you also said that micro-fulfilment is a buzzword. Currently in the UK, the other buzzword is Brexit. Would Brexit or whatever happened with it cause any problems in the industry and in this drive to automation?
Yeah, I think short term, absolutely. The supply chain over the course of the Brexit transition period, from the vote back in 2016 to finally closing a deal on the 11th hour and 59th minute, almost as our Prime Minister did at the end of last year, there's been a huge amount of uncertainty within the supply chain industry. That uncertainty around, can I get goods out of Europe? Will I have to pay tariffs on goods that are either coming into or going out to the European Union? will there be delays at those critical points and entry and exit points of the UK marketplace? These are all things that businesses have been trying to mitigate. I remember 2 years ago, businesses started to stockpile inventory from Europe in a fear of a potential no deal or something not happening. What we've certainly seen for the last couple of years is businesses now saying, this isn't, we need to carry on. We need to continue the investment. We can't be stopped by Brexit. I think short term, there will be some delays and definitely some changes in procedures that will slow things down a little. But I think most supply chain companies, most logistics companies that are involved in warehousing and distribution have actually put things in place now to try and smooth out those curves, smooth out those peaks and troughs of disruption as much as possible to ensure that goods are available when they're required by people in the UK. And equally, they can support people that are exporting to the EU and the rest of the world as well. So I think in terms of Brexit, there will, from our perspective, I think, continue for probably 3 to 6 months being some disruption until things settle down. And most of that, I believe, is generated by the very late deal that we finally seen signed between the UK and the European Union in terms of what that looks like. And then it's going to take some time for that to actually get put into place.
And finally, about Autostore, what are your goals? What do you want to achieve? What do you provide?
So Autostore as a business, first and foremost, is a well-established business. We created our cube storage technology back in 1995 because we ran out of space in our own warehouse. So many of the challenges that are faced by not just the UK, but actually warehouse and logistics companies across the world, we actually faced in our own business, which is why we came up with this technology. As a business, we continue to develop, we continue to evolve the platform that's been in existence for 25 plus years. What we're now looking at as we go forward is how do we help new sectors? We've got a very strong established base in many, many different market sectors that's centered around the distribution and warehousing network, those traditional logistics hubs that are designed for mass storage of inventory and then sending that out across into the sort of retail stores or whatever else. What we're now looking at is how do we support with our technology new areas? So things like the micro-fulfilment, things like the urbanization. What we see now as a trend going forward, not just in the UK, but especially across Europe and the rest of the world, is city centre wise, people want things local. They want an increased amount of inventory at local level. And actually, they want to receive their goods when they want it, but they want to receive them in an ergonomically, environmentally friendly way. So utilizing things like autonomous robot deliveries, things like 3PLs, we've all seen the Deliveroos and the Ubers actually now doing localized delivery. And more retailers are starting to buy into that idea of these companies that can do that last mile delivery, that last mile fulfillment. That requires actually reutilizing and redefining the space that's available. So imagine some of those derelict retail units on the high street today, those boarded up shops. They could become mini warehouses for retailers, where actually the consumer doesn't go into that space, but it becomes a small distribution hub for that particular town or city centre or area. That takes technology like ours, and that's one of our big focus points now. So really still supporting that existing warehouse business and that industrial industry that we've been supporting for many years, but looking at these new avenues for exciting new projects around urban fulfillment, around micro-fulfilment, around that, supporting that last mile delivery in as clean and environmentally way as possible. So the growth of our business going forward is definitely going to be centered around the retail sector, around urban, no question whatsoever, and around supporting those businesses.
Thank you very much for your time. It was very, very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's great to talk to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe and like. You can also join our mailing list. The link is in the description down below. See you soon.